Everything is tuberculosis. Welcome to Speed Reads. In Everything is Tuberculosis, John Greene sets out to do more than educate readers about a disease. He crafts an emotionally rich, intellectually engaging, and morally provocative work that repositions tuberculosis, TB, not as a medical relic, but as a living, devastating reality. The book opens with a powerful and deeply human narrative, the story of Henry Ryder, a 17-year-old boy from Sierra Leone, who is fighting a brutal and prolonged battle with multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis, MDR-TB. Henry's story becomes the heart of the book, grounding the reader in the lived experience of TB far beyond statistics and abstract facts. Greene meets Henry through his relationship with Partners in Health, a global health organization, and follows his journey as he struggles to access basic care, navigate the stigma of disease, and persist through painful and complex treatments. Henry often walks miles to the clinic, endures severe drug side effects, and faces food insecurity, all while maintaining hope and dignity. Greene weaves his own personal experience into this narrative, admitting that even with all his advantages, he struggles with medication compliance. The contrast makes Henry's perseverance all the more striking and highlights how poverty, geography, and systemic neglect magnify the burden of disease. From Henry's personal struggle, Greene widens the lens to examine tuberculosis as a cultural, historical, and scientific force. He invites readers into the past, revealing that TB, once called consumption, was not always seen as a disease of poverty or shame. In 19th century Europe and America, TB was romanticized, seen as a condition that struck the sensitive, the poetic, and the refined. Artists like John Keats, composers like Chopin, and writers like the Bronte sisters all suffered from TB, and their suffering was transformed into a kind of cultural nobility. Greene even discusses how the symptoms of TB, pale skin, thinness, flushed cheeks, became aspirational traits. Fashion changed to emulate the TB aesthetic. Wide eyes and fragile bodies were glorified. But this romantic image was obliterated with the discovery of the TB bacterium by Robert Koch. Once TB was proven to be infectious and transmissible, it quickly shifted from a beautiful disease of the elite to a terrifying illness of the poor, especially immigrants, minorities, and colonized populations. The stigma of TB grew, and so did the societal mechanisms that reinforced that stigma. Greene emphasizes this shift as not just a cultural phenomenon, but a political and ethical one. By rebranding TB as a dirty disease, society justified neglecting those who suffered from it. This transition into the scientific history of TB is one of the book's most enlightening segments. Greene walks readers through the work of Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, exploring how germ theory revolutionized public health. The identification of Mycobacterium tuberculosis revealed that TB wasn't inherited or inevitable. It was preventable and treatable. Early diagnostic tools like the tuberculin skin test and later the chest X-ray helped track and manage the disease. However, for decades there was no true cure. Sanatoriums, facilities where patients were isolated, given fresh air and fed nourishing food became the norm, particularly in Western nations. Greene tells fascinating stories about how entire towns, such as those in the American Southwest, emerged around TB treatment. In fact, he explains that New Mexico's path to statehood was accelerated because TB patients relocated there in droves, seeking a dry climate believed to help cure their illness. The culture of TB in this era even influenced commerce and design. For instance, John B. Stetson's recovery from TB led to the creation of the iconic cowboy hat, a design made for protection and rugged outdoor life, partly inspired by his own healing process in the American West. Greene then delves into the medical breakthroughs that truly changed the trajectory of TB in the 20th century. The discovery of streptomycin in 1943, followed by the development of other antibiotics like isoniazid, rifampin, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol, offered for the first time the ability to cure TB in most cases. However, these drugs require a strict and lengthy treatment protocol, typically 6 to 9 months, sometimes longer, which creates challenges even in the most developed healthcare systems. When patients don't complete their full course of treatment, or when drugs are not administered properly due to systemic failures, the bacteria can evolve into resistant forms. This is how MDR-TB and XDR-TB, extensively drug-resistant TB, are born. Greene explains this process with precision but avoids overwhelming jargon, making the biology of TB accessible without dumbing it down. He also introduces the concept of latent TB, which exists quietly in about a quarter of the world's population. Most will never develop active disease, but if they do, particularly in areas with weak health infrastructure, TB can spread quickly and dangerously. The book's core argument emerges forcefully in the sections that explore the social, economic, and political forces that perpetuate TB today. Greene insists that the ongoing TB crisis is not due to a lack of science or technology, but rather a failure of global prioritization. He underscores this point with the story of Shreya Tripathi, a young woman from India with drug-resistant TB who successfully sued the government for access to Bedaquiline, a new and highly effective TB medication. Tragically, though she won her case, she died before the drug could be administered. Shreya's story is not an anomaly. It represents how bureaucracy, corporate patent protections, and systemic inertia can turn treatable illnesses into death sentences. Greene particularly criticizes pharmaceutical companies like Johnson & Johnson for holding exclusive rights to life-saving drugs and enforcing high prices or restrictive licensing, making these treatments inaccessible in the countries that need them most. He explains how these companies often argue that high prices are necessary to fund innovation. But in the case of TB, where demand is largely in poor countries, there is no financial incentive to innovate. As a result, nearly 50 years passed between the release of rifampin and the next new TB drug. Greene describes this as a classic example of market failure. If poor people are dying, there's no market. If rich people were dying, we'd have a cure. Despite its intense subject matter, Everything is Tuberculosis is not a book without hope. Greene dedicates substantial space to highlighting stories of resistance, resilience, and progress. He shares data showing that countries like Peru, through investment in community health workers and decentralized care, have achieved over 85% cure rates for MDR-TB. He also documents how activists, journalists, and survivors are raising awareness and demanding change in international forums. Partners in Health, where Henry receives care, is shown to be an example of a virtuous cycle, an organization committed to breaking down the barriers that make TB a disease of inequality. Greene's own activism becomes part of the story. He describes how he used his YouTube channels, podcast platforms, and public appearances to pressure companies and governments to change. He launched petitions, met with experts, and invited his massive online following to engage with the topic. Rather than positioning himself as a savior, he acknowledges the discomfort of his privilege and uses it to amplify the voices of those like Henry and Shreya, whose lives were shaped by forces far beyond their control. As the book moves toward its conclusion, Greene reflects on the emotional toll of bearing witness to such suffering. He speaks candidly about his own battles with anxiety and depression, and how working on this book forced him to confront despair in new ways. Yet he insists that despair is not a useful response, not when solutions are available. He argues that if we believe in human equality, then every TB death is an unacceptable tragedy. The cure exists. The tools exist. What is missing is the will to distribute them justly. He ends the book not with a tidy conclusion, but with a moral imperative. We must care. We must act. Not only because we can save millions of lives, but because doing so affirms our shared humanity. Greene's writing, infused with compassion, insight, and urgency, makes clear that TB is not someone else's problem. It is everyone's problem. And by telling stories like Henry's, exploring history, confronting injustice, and modeling engagement, Everything is Tuberculosis invites readers to be part of the solution. Final thought: Everything is Tuberculosis is a rare nonfiction book that manages to be deeply informative, emotionally resonant, and morally urgent all at once. It forces readers to confront their own role, however passive, in a global crisis that has long been ignored. Greene's voice is warm, literary, and engaging, even when the subject matter is heavy. By balancing historical insight, scientific explanation, real-life stories, and personal vulnerability, he makes an ancient disease feel like one of the most important issues of our time. Ultimately, the book is not about despair. It's about possibility. The possibility of a future without TB. The possibility of a global health system that treats all lives as equally valuable. And the possibility that ordinary people, when informed and inspired, can help build that future. We hope you enjoyed this speed read. See you in the next one.